Are we failing with scaling? If so, why? Who wants to kick it off?
Yeah, maybe I start a bit. Yeah, of course. I mean, nobody ever fails with scaling. Yeah? I mean, what can go wrong? Before we go into that, maybe a short story that brought us together is actually the Agile Alliance. So the four of us also work as volunteers for the Agile Alliance. The Agile Alliance is a non-profit organization in the US, and we are a part of a group that is coming together frequently, a bit as a think tank, to think about how can we support Agile adoptions. And out of these conversations, the whole topic of scaling, and especially Marcin and me, like Ericsson wants to be as small as Spotify and so wildly creative with all this fantastic tribe stuff.
And not Spotify, of course, wants to be as big as Ericsson.
Yeah, and you're falling into all the traps that we fell in, and I can't stop you from that. That's yeah. So scaling is difficult, and maybe we start with a little story about Peter, Paul, and Mary.
Yeah, that's yours.
Let's use that. So in the article we wrote, we also to illustrate a couple of things. One thing is the story of Peter, Paul, and Mary. So Peter, Paul, and Mary, they can't agree. Yeah. So one wants to go to the zoo, the next one wants to go to the cinema, and the third one wants to go swimming, and they just can't agree what they want to do. You know, they all have the same goal. They want to have fun. Yeah. So because they can't agree, they need to go to mommy. Mommy, you need to decide for us because we can't agree. Mommy is a very good mommy, but she has also many kids. So she needs some staff function, nanny. So nanny is appointed by mommy to help the kids to take these difficult decisions. And of course, these decisions, I mean, the kids want to have fun, you know? How can you have good fun? Yeah, you need to make sure that this is a good decision. So we asked the kids, so okay, how much is the cinema ticket? How much is the zoo ticket? How much does it cost to go to swimming? What do you think? How much fun you will get out of this? So yeah, so after evaluating all these things, you make a fair decision, and then they go. Of course, when they return, you want to know, was this a good decision or not? So you ask them to write a report on how was it, the level of fun, and so on. Yeah. You see where this is going? So this is how we tend to scale. Yeah, we are trying to build a staff function, and because the kids are getting more and more of these questions come up just to make a good decision. I mean, we need some people who can properly investigate how much does it cost. Maybe the kids should not be bothered about estimating the cost. Maybe that should be someone else. So we hire more people to do these estimates. Or then these reports are coming back. Maybe we need people to look at these reports, and every now and then somebody should do an audit and go with the kids to the place just to see whether they really report this right, and so on. So staff functions, they just grow because they exist. And at the bottom of the whole thing, there's just one problem. Peter, Paul, and Mary couldn't agree. Yeah? That's the whole thing in the bottom of the thing. So writing this article, we actually found that there's maybe 3 confusions that we have seen in companies when trying to scale. So companies are confusing scaling with growing. There's a confusion about complicatedness and complexity. And there's a confusion of technical skills versus competence or social skills. Yeah? What do you hire for? And to illustrate this a bit, we are now going to tell you 3 stories, and then the 4th one will come later on, about all these things, just what we have failed with. So let me start with a story from the company I work for, Ericsson. Ericsson, I don't say this too loud because, you know, I'm ashamed of this. So, welcome to Cloud City.
It's recorded, Hendrik.
Yeah, it's recorded. Yeah. So, it's 2011, 2012, I can't remember, it's more than 10 years ago that this happened. Ericsson is in the telco space, and we see, okay, a new technology thing that's really coming up is cloud. I mean, we had these big monolith, we virtualized them to make them run on different kinds of hardware, and now the cloud comes. Okay, we need cloud. But the cloud platforms are not telco-grade. We need to build a telco-grade cloud platform. Whatever that means, we need to build it. Okay, so how do we build it? Let's first of all, let's appoint somebody to run the product management, because there needs to be someone who can look into what are the requirements, what should this thing be able to do. Let's recruit somebody who can be the head of the product development organization. And then they are asked to build an organization. And basically, they follow the blueprint that we have everywhere else in the organization. So we are recruiting 200 people into the development. So that's a proper size. We think that is what is needed to build this cloud platform. And then a head of technology is appointed, a head of operations and programs, the head of product introduction and deployment support, and all these kind of things. Yeah. So these people are there. They are trying to figure out what's needed, what needs to be implemented. We are wrestling with the requirements, and after a year and a half or something, we have a first cloud platform, but the integration of the thing is a mess. I mean, it just doesn't work. The network functions that should use this cloud platform, they have a hard time integrating the thing. Quality is, and there's a lot of debate on, are these the right requirements? No, there were a lot of misunderstandings in the organization. So there's a lot of technical debt. We need to clean up, correct things, re-implement stuff that hasn't worked, and so on. Yeah, this journey I think it took them 3 years before we had a somewhat okayish product, but the quality was not good. After 4 years, we ran into a big crisis, and in the end, what happened was the whole thing was reorganized again. We brought in a guy who was known to be a leader who can fix problematic areas, and then with a rigid grip on the thing was repaired, so to speak. Yeah. So that was a bit the journey that we had on this thing, and of course we have also positive growth stories, but this is where we failed by just copying the blueprints that everybody else had, founding a company, a subsection of 200 people in one go.
So let's go to the holy grail of scaling, the Spotify model. Everybody copies that, so tell us what is right, Marcin.
Yeah, I've been trying to go on conferences for the last 6 years, trying to repeat just one message. If you do anything with Spotify, just don't copy the model. It's getting a little easier these days, because not only can I say that, this has changed, but if anyone today has implemented tribes and thinks that that's what Spotify does, I'm happy to announce that Spotify no longer uses the word tribe. So there you go. So you're a little bit behind. But I'm going to tell you a story about how we've tried to wrestle with one aspect of our company culture that was challenging when we started scaling, and that was autonomy. So I think many of you would associate Spotify with a company that goes through piles and piles of these every week. And indeed, especially before the pandemic, that was the case. You would see those Post-it notes strewn all over the office with super integrated collaborative spaces. But the reality was that a lot of our teams have been working in a very disconnected but deliberately isolated way. We've created infrastructure, we've created architecture of our services that allowed pretty much every single team that we called squads, which are probably still called squads, but it's bound to change any minute now, that those squads actually, beyond certain point of complexity of our product and scale of our product, could no longer create coherent solutions. And we started really worrying that, what we're going to see is we're going to see a product that doesn't feel like a product built by a handful of people, but a product built by, 200, 300 separate teams. So of course we decided to coordinate and create more alignment on top of that disconnected, let's say, or somehow aligned, but high level of autonomy. So of course, we wouldn't take anything off the shelf, but you may see some inspirations in some of the things that I've talked. But one of the things we did do was we've decided that in order to manage this, what we felt was increasing complexity, we would create a PMO. Because as everyone knows, the way to solve for complexity is to manage it by bringing in program managers who can, of course, look after the whole thing, pull it together, and execute it flawlessly. And then instead of this, we started having this. And as you can imagine, that was an attempt to manage this complexity. But instead, what we've actually introduced was complicatedness. We made this complex thing not only complex, but also complicated. And then we had to have people who were trying to coordinate everyone and run those huge spreadsheets and try to have every single item that the thing people were working on captured in these spreadsheets. So what happened next? We've been looking at how this happened, and it turned out that actually some of these program managers were still able to successfully deliver their programs. And some program managers, not so much. And mind you, these were like really huge programs that took 6 to 12 months. That's huge in our scale, or at least with our perspective. None of the 3-year things. Sorry, Hendrik. But still, we felt that if we've invested 6 or 12 months into something and that wasn't bringing impact, that wasn't a great outcome. And it turned out when we really started understanding and looking into what was the difference between these program managers that were successful and those that didn't quite have the outcomes that we were hoping for, it turned out that their work wasn't so much focused on bringing those spreadsheets and making them ordered and complete, but it was connecting the right people in the organization with each other. So they were spending most of their time talking to teams and saying, hey, you have to talk to Team X, and Team X has to talk to Team Y. And by the way, if the 3 of you meet, you can solve this in 2 minutes. So that's how we've kind of went a little bit into this world of complicatedness and then stepped back by realizing that it is really a lot about the informal network and how we cultivate this network across the company much more than creating these spreadsheets and having data around it. And I think Darja will tell us later a little bit more about networks, but it's Jens's time.
Right, so we failed way better, I have to say. So we did not confuse complexity and complicatedness, but we worked with some extremely highly skilled individuals. So this is silicon chip. This is the type of stuff that works. Actually, this is an old one, a digital F7, I think. But the chip we were working on is one of these stuff that is working in tablets. And the way this stuff is built is literally for every square millimeter, there is one world-class expert really knowing what this is and how this should be built. So highly skilled people. I don't think I've ever worked with more intelligent and better educated people than in this. So the challenge there was a little bit like yours and yours. These were not only 5 experts, so there was no means to get them into a room and let them call Scrum and then everything works. But these were 600 people worldwide. So there were these really bright people knowing about power management, which is, I think, left corner or something, in Denmark. And there was these extremely bright people knowing everything about radio transmission, some in Dresden, some in Munich, some down in France. And there was this project manager in India, this technical manager actually, who was responsible to commit. So he was the only person who was actually allowed to press the button saying, okay, this one is done. And then I asked him, what do you know that the engineers don't know that could make you make that decision? He said, oh, that's a good question. So our problem was we wanted to kind of get an overview. And of course, we know this isn't a complicated problem, but if you go into an organization of that size, it's always complex. So we use the Kanban approach, and you see that kind of here. So if you look at the upper ones, they kind of do deliver. If you look at the low ones, this is how waterfall looks like in Kanban. And the project manager once said to me, you see, I've never had so much transparency about what is going wrong. and I never had so few ideas what to do. The major problem was that all these different engineering departments, I think the first common manager was on C-level. And this was a Fortune 50 company. So no way that the C-level would ever deal with stuff like that. So there was no one responsible there to actually change the structure. Something Sasha and I jumped on yesterday. So the structure in this organization was built in a way that they were unable to deliver. So we had a lot of technical skills, but the competence of the organization to actually produce a product was below that. Let's put it that way. So we had these three different stories of different aspects, how you can fail with, probably I should say how we failed. We went out, I think, after 50 months. We had set up a list of things you should change, and if you don't change that, sorry, we can't help you anymore. So they choose not to work with us anymore. And then they abandoned the project, I think, half a year later, after nearly 2 years, with a loss of, I think, something between 20 and 40 million euros, which wasn't that much because they had saved travel costs of at least 50,000 euros before, with us not letting go around. So they had saved some part of that, but eventually we killed that. So if you think about your organization, what is it that your organization confuses most? Just go to Mentimeter. Maybe, Hendrik, you have to go a little bit down.
Oh,
so
yeah.
or
Down.
There's the QR code. Yeah.
So
Do you get it?
what do you confuse in your organization? Scaling, or complicatedness, or technical skills?
Or all three of them?
All three of them.
Yeah.
And to what extent?
Yeah, exactly. To what I mean, you can think about this again. With how much your company is focused on scaling, as in just adding complexity, adding layers, adding people, versus trying to grow the organization. To what extent you're actually recognizing that there's complexity in your organization, and you're working with that complexity deliberately, or whether you're trying to complicate, add a layer of complication on top of that complexity, hoping that that will solve it. And then in the third question, consider to what extent you're really focusing on the technical skills and confuse hiring the brightest minds into the organization versus growing the wider competencies. Jens talked about the organizational competencies in our discussions. We've also talked about social competencies that people have.
The ability to agree on things after a dispute.
All right, so we're gonna...
While we wait for that, one final story on that. It took us 6 months to figure out that out of these 600 people, actually 60 managers were existing. The others weren't existing at all. So this is about social competencies.
Right. Should we have a look?
Yes, let's have a look.
Aye. All right, so we have 40 answers. This is amazing. Thank you so much for playing with us.
And this is interesting, yeah. So complicatedness with complexity is at the moment at the forefront.
Absolutely.
And there's a pretty big bump on the right side. So this is seems to be a very common thing here. While scaling with growth, that is actually quite across the board.
Yeah. So we are lucky here. We do have a researcher who can tell us what went wrong and what to change. So please enlighten us, Darja. But I think you wanted to start with the story.
Yes, of course. I could not come without a story, and the story is research-based story, and it is about a very unfortunate event in NASA history. It's about the shuttle Columbia crash. And of course, there were researchers from different disciplines coming to try to understand what was the root cause. And one story that I find extremely interesting and enlightening is connecting the social network of NASA experts to what has happened. And what the researchers have found is they have mapped a single individual in an organization into the designed information exchange, which is quite hierarchical. We will connect to the overarching theme of this conference here. The hierarchy that we create, how people are supposed to communicate, actually is the root cause of all evil in the organization. And in this case, it truly mattered a lot. So researchers have read all the protocols of the meetings, the meeting notes, and looked at who has been present in which meeting. So they have also created the actual information exchange. And they have found that the information about the crash, that it will happen, existed before the launch. So the organization knew about it. There were technical experts, so they were technical, skilled individuals delivering very complex message to the wrong people who did not prioritize or pay attention enough to this information, who have actually passed it up the hierarchy, but it never gained the deserved attention because the technical people were not following with the information. So by creating these hierarchies and tunnels and chains of information exchange, we also dilute the message, and we also not allow the message be, or the network be penetrated in different ways, in different directions. So the researchers also showed the ideal information exchange network, how it should have been. And it looked very much connected or a star-based. It's not fully net. Of course, you might expect that the ideal world is fully connected. But here, the researchers said it would have been enough if the actual network resembled the star or something close to the star. I've also done some research of my own in one large Swedish telecommunication company.
We won't tell which one.
No, and one music streaming company.
Yeah, we won't mention them.
And one of the questions that I really like to ask managers is what is the number of individuals that teams collaborate with? And apparently, I think we can ask you guys also, what do you think an autonomous team is having as a network? Just shout out. 5 people. 7. 10. 10 is the magic number, actually. When I ask, the average answer or the most common answer is 10. It's way more than that. So in a more hierarchical organization, that is a telecommunication, it's about 25, 35 individuals that one team handles on a regular basis. 11 individuals was the smallest network we've seen of a newly created team with people, half of which are taken from the graduates into the company recently. And the microservice-oriented company, music streaming company, has over 50 individuals in a possession of one team. And up to 68 was the highest number of individuals. It's self-reported when people report who they acquire the knowledge and information from, and also share their knowledge too. So these networks are huge, and you can see that a small team is like a piece of a network and a piece of an ecosystem. They act as they negotiate, they work as connectors of information and spreading the information, helping out. In some companies, there are these go-to people and also channels everything is digitalized. You can ask a channel, please help me, I have a question. And then there would be 20, 30, 40 experts on a daily basis looking for questions and answering, unblocking people on a distance without knowing them.
So I think these are sometimes shockingly big numbers, and you might think like, oh my God, this is not good, but is it really not good? I think what is good is a question that is not really answered. We just know that when we have too many interfaces, the communication bandwidth that needs to go into this is lowering the ability actually to develop and deliver something.
Absolutely.
So where is a good balance? Because I mean, we want people to communicate, we want people to collaborate across, and we want people to self-organize around the thing. Yeah. So these are networks that are not actually created through the hierarchy, but those were artifacts of self-organization, I think, right?
Absolutely, and it goes together with Conway's law, which we talked about yesterday. The informal organizational structure actually resembles the technical structure. So all the efforts to decomplex the system, this organization, should be focusing on decomplexing the dependencies on a technical level, and then there would be fewer dependencies on a social level as well.
And I think this goes down to this scaling versus growth. I think it's worth to explore that a little bit more, because there seems to be some confusion on that. That the standard approach of organizations is to reduce communication between teams, which is scaling. So you might start with PI planning and pre-PI planning, pre-PI planning, which is just about reducing communication between teams. Does that make any sense in your case, Hendrik?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing is, what communication bandwidth is needed to keep something coherent? That's always the problem, because in our case, yeah, we are always this a bit like, oh my God, look at them, so many people and so on. Like my organization, 1,200 people. Of course, they work on 10 different products, and they are bundled together because there are dependencies, technical dependencies, and they come partly out of standardization efforts, global standards, agreements that were made across the planet, how things work together. So there is a good reason and good intentions around the whole thing. And then, of course, you have simply this challenge: how do we keep this coherent between so many people? And then, yeah, exactly these kind of things are in when you come from a hierarchy, you think like, let's add another piece in the hierarchy to make this work. Yeah, so let's make Scrum of Scrum of Scrum of Scrums, or something like this, or product owners, proxy product owners, and whatever. And what we learned from the cases is that this is not the right, it's intuitive, but it's the wrong intuition. We need to unlearn these kind of things and rather stop scaling this way and rather growing a bit more natural. That's why we, for example, started to say, actually our staff functions, it's not that they are necessarily all bad, but they should not be too big, because the bigger they are, the more they start creating job for themselves. So let's understaff these central functions. Yeah, so they don't even have the bandwidth to go into the details. They should just stay on a level where they can add the value by bringing communities and people together. I think you should talk to you, because what we have now observed, there is a dependency, and you need to, can you please handle this? Connectors.
Exactly. I mean, and that's something that if you think like so for example, at Spotify, we absolutely have hierarchies. People report to a manager, right? And in these, if you look, there is a org chart that you could say, okay, here's like a nice little tree that Darja was showing before. But the point is that tree in our case is not equivalent to the network of information exchange. And in fact, one of the most important roles of managers in our company is to make sure that they connect across the organization. So this is when people start and ask like, what's the one thing I can do to be most successful here? I think almost everyone who's been at the company for a while tells them like, grow the largest network you can. Because the more people you know, the more connections you can create, the more you can then leverage these connections when you actually start delivering on projects. So, like I was mentioning, for example, these program managers, they need to make sure that they're not the custodians of information, but curators of the information, so that they give the right information to the right audience to allow these different teams, different managers to interact with each other, not through the program manager, for example.
And that's a bit what I did when a year ago I became the head of this 1,200 people organization. And then the question is, how do we work with this? So when I came in, there was the traditional operational steering groups and management and leadership teams and whatever, with long action point lists and standard agendas and all this stuff.
So you introduced Jira.
Exactly, we introduced Jira. No, actually, I did something that confused a number of people very much when I started, and because I'm looking at this more from organization design is for me communication design. So I was starting to think who should talk to whom about what at what frequency. Yeah. So now I have a Monday, which is a governance Monday. Governance sounds so serious. Actually, it's just a series of conversations, of 1 hour conversations distributed over the Monday. And for example, I have a meeting where people who are on capability management, they know where we have free teams and they know about costs and all this stuff, meet with the program managers and the line managers. This is a conversation we need to have, because we need to see where are the programs struggling, where is the operation execution struggling, do we need more people, should we shift finances somewhere else? And this is a conversation. The meeting does not have an agenda. So people were actually, in the beginning, they thought like, okay, what is the agenda bullet point that we should follow now? No, we just come into the meeting. It happens every Monday, so why have an agenda? We just come in and say, okay, what are the things that are pressing now? What do we need to talk about today? And then as a team, we start talking about the things that matter. And out of that emerges a conversation about the most relevant thing right now. There was a discussion, somebody came, Hendrik, I think we need an action point list here. And I said, no, we don't need that. So we had a bit of a debate around that, because I think if I need to be the daddy of people reminding others you haven't fulfilled your action point, something goes wrong. If the action point doesn't happen, it will reappear in the meeting sooner or later, and then we have to deal with it as a team. Yeah? But what emerged out of that discussion was, for example, that there are some topics that we might do revisit. Yeah, so we might say, this is unfinished, we are on the journey here, but it's not let, I think we need to talk about this in 2 weeks again. So we have a list of topics that we need to schedule at a later meeting. So in the beginning, it created a lot of confusion having these more loose things, but focusing on the interaction. And I can tell you, over a year, in the beginning, it was still everybody waiting for me to open the meeting and so on. And in the meantime, this is a fantastic conversation. Every Monday, we come out of the Monday, and it's a heavy day because it's a lot of stuff we are looking at. But in the end, everybody has all the contextual awareness, the information, knowing this is the thing I will convey further into the organization over the week.
And you reminded me, Hendrik, of a similar move that I did in my organization a few years ago, where, we had probably not the same scale, but maybe 14, 15, 20 teams over time working together. And we asked those 20 teams to come for half an hour before lunch. It was before lunch on Wednesday. So we wanted to make sure that the meeting kind of finished on time.
That's very clever.
That's a nice little tactic. Didn't always work, but most of the time people were getting hungry enough to finish in time. But we just asked them to talk about what they're working on. So this, you could say like, okay, this sounded like stand-up. But many of these teams were not teams necessarily working directly on the same thing together. So for weeks after weeks, I had people coming to me and say, like, that meeting is a waste of time. People are talking about something that is irrelevant to me. I'm not getting a lot of information. And then after 4 or 5 months, I started talking to people like, oh, here's a new project that we have to build. And then I could just go to one team and they said, yes, but we need these 3 other teams. I'm like, how do you know? Well, because that's what they're working on, right? And that they realized that through that meeting, through just listening to what other people are working on. Of course, there was a coherence in the organization. These were not just 20 completely random teams. And even when people started being in those meetings, like you say, like without necessarily super structured agenda, without points being taken, there would almost always be someone say like, oh, we have to have a follow-up conversation. And that moment of like two people saying we have to have a follow-up conversation was worth the 30 minutes of 20 people in the room.
And I think there's an important point here, because most classical management theory thinks that you have to do things very efficient, which is efficient meetings, which means agenda and action items, and then we're done with the next one. This is perfectly suited to convey expected information. If you're in a complex environment, well, the information that really matters is the information you don't expect to appear. And so the most important thing about growing, not scaling, growing, is to provide enough space that unexpected information can actually convey wherever it needs to. And I think this is also something we can learn from the Columbia part. So this might be a Slack. You start regular meetings, something like that. And the more you interact on a daily basis, the more happens of that. And the more you distribute it, you probably have some numbers on that. The more you distribute it, the less stuff like that just happens. So the more you have to care from a management perspective that it happens.
I think one thing that we see in research is that the more silos are in the organization, the more products competing with each other they create.
Some people think this is good.
Yeah, one of the things is complicatedness and complexity. One of the things, okay, as an agilist, and I'm a fan of Dave Snowden and the Cynefin framework, so complexity is really the thing. So words really matter, and we still have discussion about, oh, we are too complex, we need to simplify. And I try to tell people, hey, the antidote to complexity is not simplification. It's decomplexing. But what does decomplexing mean? So in the end, we talk about communication bandwidth that's needed to create coherence. But how do you limit that? So the ideal collaboration interface is one that you don't need. Yeah, you do not want actually people to collaborate or use collaboration as a tool to overcome deficiencies in your organizational setup. So the question is, how do we reduce those things? And a classic example is maybe microservices, using a technology, a technical architecture with microservices that allows people to not collaborate. Yeah? And this is a method of decomplexing. And maybe there is more of these kind of things we can do.
I mean, one thing that we almost constantly do is reorgs. And in many organizations, you would say like any reorganization is painful and takes a lot of time, takes a lot of planning, but and takes a lot of change management. So I don't know if any of you have experienced anything around change management, planning change management, doing change plans. And it turns out that actually change management is only required if you're trying to inflict change on someone else. If they have been part of this change, you don't need to manage anything because people already understand what needs to happen. But if you create in the organization an expectation that the structure that exists today is not necessarily the structure that will exist tomorrow, you can start looking for exactly what Hendrik was talking about, which is where are these opportunities where we could move people around, move teams so that they're closer together and they don't have to, for example, have this interface across the organizational boundary. So sometimes that refactoring, which I hope your engineering teams do on a daily basis to the code base, is exactly the same thing that we should be looking at in terms of refactoring the organization.
I respectfully disagree. Not with the refactoring part, I'm fully aligned with that. With your statement that you don't need change management if people kind of change by themselves. I think it actually depends more on the level of management. So change management in the way, okay, now this team changes and then that team changes, this is obsolete. I'm completely with you. Still, I think you need some people, a group of people, who take care that the communication actually takes place in the daily work. Because most people, they do have to do some work.
I
So-
call that leadership.
Okay, if you want to make
But
that
yeah,
difference.
you're absolutely right. Like, I mean, there needs to be a direction and an idea of what we're trying to achieve and an outcome that we're going towards. Yes, it's not just complete chaotic.
I was going to say that imagine social networks, loose and dense. And of course, in a loose network, reorganization is a big problem because you need to get to know people. You remember yesterday we talked about forming, norming, storming, performing. If you have a dense network, you know a lot of people around you. So reorganizing with people you know is not as big problem. And I think this is one of the best benefits and clear values that a network, and investing into network, which is not really low-hanging fruit for organizational management, is.
We had for a time, in the beginning, in our agile infancy, we also had this discussion. Yeah, high-performing teams means people stay together for a very long time and so on, and we paid a bitter price for that. No, we had one team that was together for like 3 years. And then we wanted to do some changes, and these people said, "No, these are fantastic people I work with. I do not want to work with anyone else." Yeah. So one of the learnings that we had was that it's actually quite good to disrupt a team also every now and then, because it's not the team, it's the skill of teaming. Now we come to technical skills versus competence, the ability to team up with others that you need to nurture, and that sometimes you need to do a bit forcefully, get people out of the comfort zone, and that's again, I think, something that leadership needs to take care of.
Yeah, but I absolutely agree that I think the notion that the most effective teams are the teams that have been together for a very long time, in my experience, is becoming more and more obsolete. And it doesn't mean that relationships don't matter; they actually matter a lot. But there are so many different ways in which we should cultivate these relationships, get people to work together, but also give them the skills of being able to come into a new team. So I'll quote another researcher, even though you're here, Amy Edmondson has, that you hopefully have heard of from her work around psychological safety, has also actually studied this idea of teaming and how the really performant teams have the skill of being able to move and form teams very quickly. So I'm not such a big fan of Hackman anymore.
So there's one important thing here. If you think about how organizations work, even though they have been reorganized. So there's a big change in the organization. Everything stays the same. It works a little bit less than before, but everything stays the same, which actually means that organizational structure doesn't matter. And if you think about how much time management invests into thinking about organizational structure, footnote, because it's about power, end of footnote, it actually means that they don't care about the stuff that really matters, which is creating networks, investing into people getting together, but rather invest into PowerPoint slides, which is a pity. So growing actually means investing into networks, investing into people knowing each other.
I wonder, Jens, if at this point, I mean, we've been doing this for quite a while, if at this point maybe some ideas or questions are forming in your minds. Is there anything that you would want to bring to the stage and let us talk through?
Dennis has a...
Thanks, Marcin. I immediately was triggered by a few things you said, obviously, but there was this one thing. We've had Heidi Helfand here, I think, 5 years ago maybe, and there was this one sentence in her speech which I will never forget, when she said, and this is a quote, and it's also mentioned in her book, and I don't remember the name of the person she quoted, which is a pity, I shall have to look that up, but he said, "Reteaming is inevitable, we may as well try to get good at it." And since then, I have applied this general sentence to so many areas. When you just said, organizational change will happen, there's no way we can prevent that. why do we not try to invest in making it less painful? Right? We should do that. But many companies dread this. They don't even try.
I think the person you're after is Heidi. I have forgotten her last name. She wrote this book. Yes. Exactly. Yeah.
She has the book is from someone else.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks. A really interesting concept of differentiating between scaling and growing. My question is the data of your research, whether it had any aspects related to outcome versus output-based approach. Because, of course, if you scale the value, and that's where I agree with you, is to reduce the communication so that the value can be delivered. And in growing, where it's more about communication, of course, we also have meetings where the example which you gave, no agenda, 1 hour sitting in a meeting and still no one comes out with any outcome, and it's become a sort of toxic culture. So, I mean, whether you have any data on that kind of way of working, yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, the data that we have, of course, is more coming from seeing the backlogs and seeing our product roadmaps and what functionality do we get out. How's the quality situation at the time of release, and those are the kind of things that we actually measure. And what I can see is that release becomes less and less of a drama through these Monday conversations. You might think, not having an agenda, what's the output of the thing? Yeah. So there is an outcome of the thing, and that outcome is very valuable, and that is alignment. We have an understanding of our common context, so when I know after this meeting, I know how the other think, I know where we are with this organization, and when I now go into my part of the thing, I can take my decisions this week without going back to these other people. So actually we are saving time later on because we do not need to reconnect because we had this conversation on the Monday. And that's a thing which material, you cannot measure this, of course. That's a bit of a pity, but what you can do is, of course, we can see this manifesting in release drama is going down. We see more and more people are teaming up and collaborating, and we are getting better and better in doing what we need to do.
2 pointers that might be worth following up on for specific examples. One is, so Gustav Söderström, our co-VP, I guess today, of Spotify, has recorded a podcast as part of the Lenny podcast series. He's been talking about how, for example, we're trying to change from a company that has what Gustav now calls competitive swimming, where we had these multiple teams that were more independent, to more synchronized swimming, where we trying to create that alignment. But another pointer that's worth looking at, which I know was a little bit of Gustav's inspiration, was the change that Airbnb did around now around the pandemic, where they've basically had lost 80% of their revenue almost overnight, and had to completely restructure as an organization. And they basically dropped all functions and brought everyone together, left 10% of the goals for the company, and focused on having that level of alignment and understanding of where we're going. That has, not focusing on the outputs, but what is the outcome of the company, generates the revenue, and they've been super successful, actually. They thought that they would not survive the pandemic as a business, and today they're thriving.
Can I be so bold as to ask a question myself first? Thank you very much. This type of meeting you mentioned, where there is no agenda and it's not outcome oriented and very efficiency driven. And Hendrik, you mentioned Kinevin, and the thought came to my mind that this is a kind of meeting that's really suited for the complex place, whereas maybe if there is a chaotic situation, the communication will change. We're not talking about this and that, but how do we get out of the building? And maybe even in the complicated area, there are different types of communication and meeting patterns. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah. First of all, this is interesting. We associate no agenda with there's no output and no outcome. Actually,
Good point.
we take decisions. We
Okay,
take
okay.
decisions.
Sorry.
In all these meetings, all the time, we are like, okay, the discussion. So now we know what to do. So we take the decision here. So people come out with much more clarity. So there is an outcome
Good point.
of the thing. So number one. The other thing is this meeting can switch mode. So we might feel, okay, here we have a chaotic situation, so how do we do this? And then we discuss in the meeting, how do we respond to that? Sometimes we have a discussion in the meeting where we are exploring something or trying to generate ideas or brainstorm. Sometimes we say, okay, we cannot have this today, maybe we need to invite some more people for this, so we spawn another session for it. We can be also in the clear mode and just say, this is, okay, here's a question, we need to channel this to that and that person, please connect to that and that person. So we are all over the place.
Great.
The place of multiple belongings. That's Knevin.
Thank you.
And
very
sometimes
much.
we are aware of our confusion.
Which is in the middle, right?
Which is in the middle, and this state of confusion I have come to admire quite a bit. Because first of all, understanding and allowing you know, there's this, we talked about leadership myth in our last meetup, and we said, like, there's so many, as a manager, as a leader, you need to be clear on things. You're never confused, you know? You must not be confused. And it's a myth. You need to allow yourself to be confused and say, you know what? We are not done with this topic. We have not reached, we don't have the feet on the, we have discussed this now. We had a workshop. We are not there yet. We could take action now, but it feels like this action will not really solve the problem. So let's let it sink in, having the patience to let the problem be the problem.
Thank you.
I wonder whether another model instead of Kinefin helps to answer that question too, which is human systems dynamics. And one of the core things to influence complex adaptive systems, especially human systems, is changing the way people interact with each other by providing spaces where they can interact, stuff like, we had that during the World Cafe yesterday when Rico, he's not here, said one of the big changes was when our upper manager said, okay, we're going to switch from Sie to Du, and the managers are going to put off their ties, which made some of the managers leaving the organization. So that was the hugest impact they could make. Not new meetings, not new structures, pre-PI planning or whatever, just let's change the way we interact. And this is one of the most powerful things.
There's another dimension that I feel maybe is under the surface here, which is, you know, like this dynamic emerges in an organization where I think, at least I hope that you have the same, Hendrik, I see in my organization, that there is a lot of engagement, right? That's like, if you're not telling people what to do, if they're not, you know, if people have to have an agenda, like they have to be told exactly what this meeting is about, it usually is also a sign of like lack of some that engagement. But if there is a culture and support in the organization of the, like, yeah, we're in this together, we're trying to solve this problem, or we're trying to build something together, that allows then for that exploration to happen.
I think there was...
We have another question here.
Thank you, Sasha. Unfortunately, my reality doesn't reflect yours, because when I'm attending meetings, somehow the really, really important things or tricky stuff is somehow avoided. And it's not talked about the real stuff, but there are so many other things you can talk about. And what do you do that you really talk about really, really important things and that you get an outcome? Because that's not my reality.
Oh yeah, that's a very good one. How do you get the organization there?
Sorry.
So, I mean, first of all, I mean, our meetings, they're scheduled for an hour, but if we are done with everybody has said what needed to be said and the conversation is over, then we just finish early. And that can happen after 15 minutes in some weeks. We just reserve an hour of time. Then how do you get these conversations going so the real stuff comes up? And that's a question of leadership, I think. And one thing I mean, 6 years I have been
But
working.
Hendrik, you make it sound like it's just about leadership. But
No, but I'm coming to that now. I've 6 years. I've worked as an in-house consultant and organizational coach. So I've been having tons and tons of workshops, sessions with teams, feedback rounds, and all this stuff. So when I got into my new role here with this super large organization, I thought like, okay, I need to give them a different experience. Because it's a question of what do they experience? Will they come up with things? Will they speak up on stuff? What really matters? So I need to go first with addressing the things. And I need to go first also with giving feedback. So I started to give people feedback at the sessions. Not every time, but when something significant happened. And that feedback can be good. I started a bit with the good stuff, saying, okay, now this was a really good session. All the great stuff that came up, I'm really happy. And I always make this personal. I'm happy about what just happened and so on. And sometimes we run into a problem, and then for me, things like the growth mindset are important to verbalize, like, wow, we have a really big challenge here, but look, we are getting even money for trying to find a solution for this challenge. Isn't this exciting? Yeah? Things like this, they sound ridiculous, but when you keep this as a narrative, people get more and more confidence in, yeah, actually we can get there. I can also give a feedback on, you know what, just a reflection on the discussion that just happened. It makes me feel very uneasy. I'm very frustrated now and also confused, because now I heard that, I heard so many different opinions now from one perspective, but I didn't really see that we tried to switch over and seeing things from another perspective. So this is not what I would like to see in this meeting. What do you say? And I invite people for, so this is how I address things via feedback, good and the critical and difficult things. And when you do this consistently, people will start chiming in. It's happening. But it's a long journey.
A lot of that is about role modeling. We're going to bring Gitta to the stage here, actually. That's a perfect opportunity, which is that so she's an Agile coach that worked with me for about a year a while ago. And one distinction that she made, which really stuck with me, was the distinction between being nice in meetings and being kind in meetings. And she talks about people, always trying to be nice to each other by being polite and by not bringing up things that might be, controversial or uncomfortable. But that behavior is actually not being kind to the other people, because that's just aggravating the problem. It's like you say, like sweeping it away. So of course it requires people, and ideally leaders, to show the example of putting themselves ideally first, not others, right? Like leaders are usually very good at putting others in a position of discomfort, but getting yourself into the position of discomfort, saying like, I don't know what we should do. Like, I need your help. Or
the thing is, and that is an observation I have as a German working in a Swedish company, and for much of my time in Sweden, Swedes are very conflict avoiding, and there is a connotation for them in their head, it seems, that every confrontation automatically will lead to a conflict. So they are avoiding the confrontation. And what I keep telling people is a confrontation is actually, let's confront each other with the difficult things, but it doesn't have to become a conflict or whatever. And that's one of the things that I like in the German culture, actually, that we can wholeheartedly disagree. I have seen Germans screaming at each other and then going out for a beer afterwards because we have cleared the air. And that is something that I'm missing sometimes in the Swedish
Swedes
culture.
don't go out for beer. That's the problem.
That's the thing.
I doubt that one.
Beer is too expensive in Sweden. That's the problem.
So one of the things I do in that situation is first ask myself. Usually I ask a colleague and reflect that together. Why didn't I raise that topic in that meeting? Because that's my choice, not to raise it. And I try to understand what's going on in my head so I don't raise that, which usually comes to some insight, and so I know what to do differently to raise it next time. And I don't think there's one recipe. There's one ingredient that comes here over and over again, which is time. There's no single thing you can do right and then everything is fine. This is a learning journey. And personally, I would say it's mostly a learning journey about myself. Why do I avoid a conflict? Why don't I get into that?
Self-leadership is a very important skill to invest into. And I know you have some programs around that, and I've also now started with that.
We have another one here.
Yeah, thank you very much for the panel, and also talking a lot about alignment and the communication structures was very interesting to me. I'm just wondering, do you use artifacts as well? Do you have any conceptual ideas of maybe the level between the product backlog and the product or service level that you work with in order to make the ideas that come out of the meetings more concrete, so to speak, and might help with alignment? Thank you.
Yeah, okay, I mean, we use Jira.
Jira Align.
Jira Align. Yeah, I mean, one of the discussions we had was, okay, backlog, the Highlander principle, there can be only one. And then how are but different parts of the organization take care of different parts of this one backlog, and there has been a lot of discussion how do backlogs communicate with each other, and who are the people then communicating with each other. And that is a bit the discussion that we had, and there's of course a tooling behind the thing. Yeah, Jira is one of those which helps us with this, but this is also giving us a hint, again, who should talk to whom at what frequency about what. So things are transported, because in the end the question is, how do you do dependency management between things? So the thing is, sometimes there is backlog items that several organizations need to work on, and so it ends up on the local backlogs of different organizations. And then how do you institutionalize, how do you manifest this? So maybe we need to tell some teams, you need to talk to each other without telling them what to do. We can say, you, and you, maybe you need to talk to each other because there's a dependency between all of you, and you will sort it out, self-organize around it. That could be.
But I think the question was also a little bit about like how to pull them together, because I think I agree very much with that, and that tends to be at the execution level, right? But then there is also an alignment on the direction and the strategy. And I mean, the classic tool here is some sort of North Star framework, right? So there's a direction for the organization that is, I don't know, 5-10 years in the future, that is broken down in some ways. But the one thing, then into maybe a 2-year focus areas and then a yearly goals. But these, I think the mistake that I have seen is people overinvest in like structuring these and making these perfect, but also trying to make these strictly hierarchical. So that like every single piece of work that you do in your in your department has to directly map to a goal at the next level, and these goals have to directly map to the top level. That doesn't work. Trying to do that is again working against complexity. But having a direction, of course, and how it's expressed depends on what format actually the organization consumes. So in some organizations, I've seen this work very well with just presentations. Some organizations had like hierarchical Jira backlogs. Some organizations had just sheets.
OKRs. You see
yeah, absolutely.
Often,
OKRs. Exactly.
To the good and the bad. There's one of our friends, Bjarte Boxnes. He's one of the people on the Beyond Budgeting. And one word I learned from him that I really like is translating instead of cascading. So often goals are cascaded. I tell you this is the goal, you go for this goal. And he says in Beyond Budgeting, and I like that a lot, is you're translating the goal. So you think, okay, this is the goal, the overarching sense of direction that we have. What is my contribution to this? So I translate the thing into my context and what me and my team can do to help the organization achieve it. I think that's a very helpful concept as well on that journey.
But of course, for that, you have to have the autonomy or flexibility or freedom in that part of the organization, so that you don't just deliver exactly what, I don't know, the head office tells you.
I want to add one more thing, which is we're talking about artifacts, but artifacts and alignment are two different things. So I wonder whether some kind of, let's call it community of practice, is also interesting. And I've read a pretty good paper. I share a lot, so maybe one of the authors might talk about that one.
Yeah, we studied communities of practice in both the telecom and the music streaming organizations, and they're used in different ways to align the organization and align different professional expertise across the organization. And what we found is that respectfully disagree with the non-agenda meetings here a little bit, because communities of practice that did not have the agenda and did not have the goal, maybe more that the goal was missing, the purpose of existence. They were like, we call them book clubs, where people get together, read a book or read something, share something interesting, but they don't really know why they're there. Whereas other types were more oriented towards alignment on technical path or coordination of work being done, and they were bringing a lot of benefits for the organization. And also we found that you don't need to come to every meeting to benefit from being a member of a community of practice. And also communities of practice don't need to be really, really large. They can have up to, 50 members, but only 20 of them come regularly to a meeting. You can skip some meetings, but being a member and just hearing the outcome of meetings or coming irregularly benefits a lot for the alignment of the organization as a whole. Would you like to add something? No.
And
Okay.
by the way, I didn't say that agenda-less free meetings are the solution for everything. So in a certain context, they make a lot of sense. I have good experience, but I agree that there's in some contexts it doesn't make sense. Then you maybe need to be a bit more clear and rigid.
We have another question here in the back.
Hello. It was a lot of talk in the the earlier part of the discussion about building organization. These informal networks, how important they are. If they are not working, we miss a lot of benefits. And I wonder how this COVID. I know you will talk about COVID after lunch, but I still would like to ask the question: what kind of impacts has that had on organization? And now we are post-COVID. That is kind of COVID, not exactly COVID, but it's kind of COVID still.
I'm very happy about the question. I was thinking, when will somebody ask the question? Because we talk about this socializing and networking, and how is it affected now? I was thinking maybe all the Germans come to work every day.
I'm Swedish. I'm Swedish.
Okay, great. Then I understand you. Where this comes from. What we see actually that the turnover rate of the companies increase, so people start quitting at a different rate than before. And of course, there is in the data a little bit biased towards COVID years where nobody changed the job. So we see a little bit of a lag of a normal attrition, but we also see that among people who quit, it's actually those who started the job in the last year or two are, accelerated, attrition is accelerated among those individuals, which is a way to explain this is that when you don't come to the office, you don't form these meaningful relationships with your colleagues and a sense of belonging to the company. And you're less loyal to the company and more likely to quit and go somewhere else for the buck. Whereas in the companies where you work and love people you work with in your team and in your organization, it will not pay a difference if somebody offers you a bigger salary, because you are likely to stick with the bodies at work. And this is one aspect that we see that actually is a benefit of coming to the office. And what else we see, there have been very interesting studies that Microsoft has done looking at the social networks. They have access to a vast majority of artifacts, emails, Slack messages, and so on, or Microsoft Teams messages. And what they have seen during the COVID, that the networks became static and the new ties did not emerge. So it means that people don't get to know new people in the organization. And then your organization, you rely on the network that you used to have during the office times. And this is a little bit worrisome, because if we don't come to the office at all, or we don't have co-presence, because just presence in the office doesn't matter really, co-presence in the office, then we lose the ability to develop these networks. And more I will tell you during my talk in the afternoon.
And another question here.
So first of all, thanks for doing your vacation over here at this lovely conference. I would like to come back to complicatedness versus complexity, and the idea of having a complicated thing, a layer on top of complexity, because I recently came around of the role profile of the so-called Agile Transformation Manager. And I would like to know, what do you think about that?
I mean, that sounds like an oxymoron to me. I thought about this so much, because the essence of what that approach of agile transformation tries to achieve is it tries to achieve a completely different, I'm trying to avoid the word mindset, but completely different way of thinking about the world, using the tooling that is grounded in the previous structure. So if you like taking the complexity language, it's very often an attempt at moving the organization towards being able to deal with complexity by using tools based on complex systems. Complicated systems, not complex systems. So we're trying to schedule everything.
You cannot delegate mindset shift.
Yeah.
So the thing is, you cannot have someone else have the experience for you. And that's the difficult thing, because what we call an agile, there is nothing like an agile transformation. What was called agile transformation is usually the initial effort or program that you initiate to do the first bigger step. But then the thing will take much, much longer. It's a journey, which will maybe never fully end, because it's all the time wrestling around the thing. So in that sense, my experience is having such a role, we had that as well. Was it helpful? Yes, because there was a person who was actually challenging, for example, me as a manager in the beginning. I mean, I must confess that when the whole thing started, I said, like, Agile sounds super cool, but not in our large company. This is impossible to do this on such a scale. I was wrong. And there were people who were challenging me on my thinking heavily. And people who were telling me, like, for example, we must ensure, I was head of program office, project office. We must ensure this and this. We need to fix this problem. That was the kind of language I was using. And then there was somebody who slapped me on the fingers and said, "You did it again. You used the ensure word again. What can you ensure, Hendrik? What are you actually doing?" And then you start as a manager thinking, okay, I'm not delivering any product. What I deliver is some spreadsheets and PowerPoint decks to governance meetings. That's what I'm doing. So actually, I cannot ensure anything. I can just create the environment where people can deliver. And having such a person that is reminding people like me about these things, that is actually a helpful thing. But it should not be a person that you do the mindset change for me. No, you will be the pain in my rear end that reminds me that I need to do something and see things differently.
And I think there's one positive about having a role like that, which means there's obviously something the senior management or executives see they think is important enough to devote a full-time management role to that. And this is something where you can build upon. So if we think about what standard ideas of management is, achiever style, it's probably not helpful. But if you have someone there who actually embarks on the full journey like Hendrik did, then this person can make a real impact on the organization. Probably not the way those who have devoted money thought, but there's something you can build upon. So I wouldn't be that negative about it, but it's probably more in a very early stage.
But I think there is so much in what is really the thinking behind it, like what's the purpose really here? And very often, the purpose is we get all the teams use Scrum, right?
Yeah.
And that's an agile transformation. And the reason I think why it is very often hard is because, like you said, like in the process of discovering what we need, it turns out that maybe let's say if there was some sort of management team that asked these people to come, or a person to come in and help with that transformation or change, it turns out that along the journey you discover things that become uncomfortable for that management team. And that's the real test of like, okay, now are we able to continue this and have the team have the growth mindset to say, actually, maybe even the way that we were trying to run the governance in this organization needs to change, and that means we need to change rather than just get someone to change other people.
I think we have time for one last question or thought or whatever. Dennis, anybody else up? Because he has already used his...
Yeah, one at the back.
Stefan.
Ah, cool.
Hello, I have one question. Yesterday we heard about Conway's Law, today we heard about Conway's Law, but every time when there's scaling, everybody comes up with, this is our new structure, this is our processes. But what you don't see is someone like, this is my architecture in 5 years. I want to have this software architecture or this IT landscape. And then we are coming up with some kind of new processes or new organization. And the architecture is the outcome of this. So we're just talking about we structure our organization and then we have the architecture.
I have a story about it, but it's a little bit longer than 5 minutes. Actually, it's the lack of technically equipped people taking decisions. So the story is that there was a product built on a platform in one organization. Then an organization built another product on the same platform. Over the years, they sent the first one to India to maintain. And then they built the third one on the same platform, which was now developed together with Indians. So 3 organizations and 3 business logics on the platform. And the second one also was destined to be sent to India, but not to the same Indian place, but to the other. And the Swedes thought, well, how difficult is that to make Indians talk to Indians? Apparently very difficult. Over the time, they split the platform into 3 different versions of the platform with 3 products built on it, and then the organization thought, oh, it's too expensive. Now let's make an investigation to bring all the versions of the platform together, because that's cheaper to maintain. And I was in the organization at that time, and I asked, do you guys consider bringing all the products together in the same location? Because that's what Conway's Law would say. They said, no. That is not going to happen. So I think that we have too few technical experts taking organizational decisions, and we forget about the architecture.
I'll add something. So at Spotify, the term I've used much more often than Conway's Law is reverse Conway maneuver, which is creating the organization in a way that we want our architecture to evolve. And that comes a little bit from this thinking that I think you kind of mentioned, not directly, and there was an Agile coach in our New York office that worked a lot with that and influenced a lot of Spotify with this, which was a model called BAPO. It's quite nice, easy to Google. And the idea is that if you want to create any change, the order you should follow is B, which is business structure, business goals. A, architecture that will support that business, then P, processes, and then the organization comes last. And of course, very often we do this exactly the opposite direction. We say like, oh, we need a new structure. Let's now create processes on top of that structure and hope that the architecture and the business outcomes come.
I would actually add an H for that, humans, but it's probably hard to pronounce. Okay, so let's summarize that a little bit. And I think our idea was that you do the summary, right? Next, yeah. Here we are. So just go to the Mentimeter and add 1 or 2 or 3 thoughts. No, the other one? Okay. What were the highlights of your conversation? And this time you're blocking the QR code, Darja. So let's move a little bit over here.
You have the code up there.
Yeah.
It's the same, yeah, it should be. If your phone still has it open somewhere on the top.
So share your highlights and maybe we prepare one final summary. Who wants to give it a go?
Don't do our mistakes.
Don't fail.
Don't fail. No, I think for me, one of the strongest learnings is that I need to look at organizations from a communication design point of view to enable better outcomes. That was a very strong thing, and I'm trying to find ways how to do that. I shared a few things with you, how I'm trying this at the moment. I hope I will find more things in the future, but this is communication design is really a thing that is in the high focus for me.
Yeah, for me, it's all about the social capital, the word, the notion of which we didn't really introduce during the talk, but it deserves the front seat in the organizations or in the journeys we are making, because way more often than not, the management cuts the budgets of retreats, of exchange visits, of social events. And that has a very big implication on the social network structures that we create in the organizations.
Yeah, for me, it's like continued creation of awareness in the organization of the difference between complexity and complicated systems, and helping people understand that the tools we use in complexity are very different than the tools that we might have been used to from the world where we could ignore complexity. So yeah, upward planning, long-term planning, for example, and tons of other things, knowing things up front, top-down, micromanagement, all these things don't work in a complex system. But it's very unnatural to us to think in that way.
My personal takeaway was that you should focus on the stuff that matters, and what matters in an organization is not what you usually talk about, which is structure and processes, but what matters is interaction between people and how you allow for interaction, even though there are more people than usually can talk to each other. And whenever you go into scaling, growth, whatever endeavor, first think about what kind of communications you want to foster and how do you want to support that. And don't go about which Jira forms to fill.